Talks about supplying Ukraine with Tomahawks are no longer just rumors. Publications in the American press today indicate that Trump administration officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirm the White House is seriously considering providing Ukraine with both these weapons and Barracuda munitions. And they are also ready to share intelligence for strikes on energy facilities deep inside Russian territory. What could this indicate? Let's talk with Podrobitsi special correspondent Dmytro Onopchenko. To gather information and opinions, he spoke with several retired top Pentagon officials. Dmytro, what did you find out?
Well, actually, opinions here differ. And I found out that retired Pentagon officials are also split into two camps, a so-called camp of skeptics and a so-called camp of optimists. And before I share their perspective, let me explain to you and to the viewers why I'm talking to retired high-ranking officials, because some viewers have even criticized me for this in the comments. The thing is, those who are currently working at the Pentagon are bound by their positions, by their ranks, and by non-disclosure agreements. They don't say anything to the press. Back when Biden and Austin were in office, it was still possible to talk to the deputy defense ministers, but now it's absolutely impossible. So there is the first camp, and in this camp, the camp of skeptics, former high-ranking Pentagon officials believe that what is happening around the Tomahawks is more of a political project, intended primarily to exert maximum pressure on Russia. In other words, when it's no longer just threats of sanctions, which, as is believed here, Moscow isn't particularly afraid of, nor some vague hints, but rather Moscow is being presented with a clear choice. Either you start negotiations or say within October, and this term is often mentioned here in the congressional corridors, they talk about October. Either real progress is made on the negotiation front within October, or for example, the Troika happens, or Ukraine actually receives missiles capable of reaching extremely important, highly secret, and highly sensitive Russian targets deep in the rear. And supporters of this version explain that this is precisely why all this information, all these hints, all these leaks are appearing in the media, because this is an indirect way of informing Russia, agree to negotiations or Ukraine will be armed. From one of my interlocutors, a person who held a very high position in the Pentagon, I even heard that there are counter-arguments, including the fact that when this weapon was being developed, when the Tomahawks were being developed, they were intended to be used to carry a nuclear warhead. And in this way, the use of this weapon by America could provoke Russia to respond with its own nuclear capabilities. This is something they fear greatly and want to avoid here in the United States. Well, I've also heard that the American military system is currently structured in such a way that both the coordinates and the order to launch a strike, as of now, would have to be provided by American or British military personnel. Supposedly, that's how the whole system works. It's impossible to do without them. And so, if this were to happen, it would be a strike on strategic targets within Russia, with the direct involvement of America. In fact, this has already happened. This isn't new either. Under Biden, there was a Dragon team at the military base in Wiesbaden, but Trump shut it down. And where's the guarantee that he'll reopen it? So in the skeptics camp, they say, look, this is a means of pressuring Russia, but it's an effective and serious one. And it's assumed that Moscow, in order to avoid this step, might agree to direct negotiations. On the other hand, there's also the camp of optimists, which also includes former high-ranking American officials. They say that Ukraine, well, this is their internal discussion, could receive the first batch, a small one, but 40, 50, 60 missiles, which would allow for precise targeted strikes as part of carefully planned special operations, specifically against super-secret, highly important Russian targets. And in this way, they could influence the Russian position not with words, not with threats, but directly on the battlefield. This would also be pressure on Russia, but of a different kind. As for intelligence, there is some fresh information. On the one hand, journalists received information that was fully authorized, only they cannot cite specific officials, that the US is ready to provide Ukraine with intelligence for launching missile strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, and that the United States is appealing to NATO allies to also provide such intelligence. And you know, this also fits into the theory of maximum pressure, public pressure on Russia. Either agree to negotiations, or this time you will face military consequences. Regarding intelligence information, the military told me some interesting information. They said that Ukraine, in principle, doesn't really need intelligence data that much, because now it uses its own capabilities. Drones, long-range means to strike deep into Russian territory. What Ukraine needs more is permission from the American administration to do this using US weapons. At this point, it doesn't really matter whether it's ATACMS or perhaps later some new weapon. But, well, the coordinates of these military targets are already known. No new intelligence is needed for this. So, to sum up, in the team of any president, we saw this under Biden as well, there are always doves and hawks. For example, there was the rather cautious Sullivan, and on the other side, the more decisive wing, like Austin and Blinken. And it's the same in Trump's circle. Part of the team will keep telling him right up to the end that Ukraine shouldn't actually be given these weapons, that it's enough to, well, use the possibility as leverage, if you will, to blackmail Russia in a positive sense of the word, by suggesting that Ukraine could receive Tomahawks and that maybe Russia will yield to the pressure. Meanwhile, the other part will advocate for a more radical solution and is already saying that if Russia simply loses 2, 3, or even 4 of its strategic facilities deep in the rear, if these are targeted strikes, then they will agree to negotiations much more quickly. Or if there are new targeted strikes on major energy infrastructure facilities. Well, that's the decision. The decision will be made solely by Donald Trump. He is the top official. He is an emotional person, and very often he makes decisions based on emotions. What people say, relaying his moods, when he talks about Putin, about Russia, about negotiations, not just on camera, but also in private conversations, his interlocutors can really feel all those emotions. They sense that his patience is also not endless. So what will happen if his patience really does run out? What if this so-called camp of optimists prevails? What exact number of missiles could be allocated? How exactly? I actually spoke with a former high-ranking Pentagon official, one of those who believes that this decision could indeed be made by the American administration. Take a look. About Tomahawks for Ukraine. How many of them are in American military stockpiles? How could Ukraine use them? It would be worth talking not just to someone from the Pentagon, but preferably to a relevant deputy minister who was once responsible for this weapon. And Mark Hunzinger is exactly that person. For several decades, he was the chief strategist of the U.S. Air Force, then of the U.S. National Security Council, and later served as Deputy Secretary of Defense. His new report, which will be released in a few weeks, is precisely about the need to deprive the enemy of safe zones in the rear, in essence about Tomahawks and similar weapons and their use.
For decades I have been studying the practice of warfare, and now I am writing about ensuring that the enemy has no protected rear areas or operational hideouts. In conflicts where we, the United States, failed to do this, we did not achieve success. And where we had the capability to reach such highly concealed bases, it usually led to a positive outcome.
Why is this weapon suitable for Kyiv? Because for decades it was used only from ships, but then they started launching missiles from trucks. Now there is both the equipment and the technology for this. And it is precisely this kind of modification that could give Ukraine an advantage.
Our Army and Marines already have ground-based launchers mounted on heavy trucks, which are mobile and difficult for the enemy to detect. In other words, they can fire and quickly change position, and the Tomahawk allows you to strike targets at a great distance behind the front line.
How far exactly? About 2,500 kilometers. This means the ability to hit places that attackers simply can't physically reach, and to deliver a precise pinpoint strike on bunkers and command posts. But that's not all.
Block V, the model currently in service with our Navy, can strike military personnel, military facilities, command posts, and important military targets. And Block V, the newest modification which we are also now receiving, can hit moving targets, including ships at sea. And this could significantly expand the list of targets for Ukraine, depriving Russia of the security of safe rear areas, because you will begin to strike critically important objects that support their offensive operations at distances that were previously considered unreachable.
What traditionally holds back the American administration from providing such weapons? It was like this under Biden, and it's the same now under Trump. Yes, it's the fear of provoking Russia. But to be honest, the military themselves are already tired of this rhetoric from politicians.
Oh, this is escalation. This will make everything worse. We've been hearing this since the very first day of the war. At first, oh, it's better to provide Ukraine with defensive capabilities, but not offensive ones. Then, well, okay, we'll give them some offensive capabilities, but with a very limited range. I believe it's time to move away from these old stereotypes, and just to be clear, I am a former Deputy Minister of Defense. I worked in the current Ministry of War. I know what I'm talking about.
Regarding the recent events surrounding intelligence data, the colonel explains that, in fact, there isn't such an acute need for it in Ukraine. And here's why.
The coordinates of stationary Russian targets, military bases, bunkers, logistics facilities, large military depots are well known. And the Tomahawk is a weapon that can be used very effectively, specifically against them. And only if you specifically plan to attack targets that are thousands of kilometers away and that can move very quickly, then you will definitely need up-to-date intelligence information.
It's important to understand, is the whole story around the Tomahawks more of a military operation or still a political one? When Russia is now faced with a choice, either negotiations or a very painful loss of its most valuable assets deep in the rear. And my interlocutor, whose strength lies precisely in strategy, believes that right now this is an effective means of putting pressure on the Kremlin.
If Ukraine does gain the capability to deprive the enemy of safe rear areas, if the distance from the front line is no longer a safety buffer for Russia and its troops, if there are no safe places left for them to conduct military operations, this is critically important for victory. But at the same time, this is a very strong signal to Russia. And not just to officials, but to ordinary Russians as well. This war directly concerns you. This isn't happening somewhere far away on a distant Ukrainian front that you barely pay attention to. Now you have to worry and care just as much as Ukrainians do.
If the green light is actually given, then Ukraine could theoretically count on a total supply of about 100 missiles, maybe a few hundred, my source says. So this really isn't a weapon for everyday use, but rather for special operations that are carefully planned and well prepared.
I think we're talking about the possibility of supplying 100 or several hundred missiles. But the time frame is a big question. Does the US military have enough ammunition for this? Many say that production needs to be increased. I believe it's quite realistic to do this and in the near future provide Ukraine with a significant quantity.
And the logic here is this: there really is a shortage of many types of ammunition in American warehouses. They were transferred to Ukraine, replacements are still being produced, but since Tomahawks have not been supplied or used throughout the war, there is a conditional stockpile from which missiles can be promptly provided to Kiev rather than placing orders with manufacturers and waiting.
To be honest, even 30, 40, or 50 of these missiles could give Ukraine the ability to strike some incredibly important targets for Russia deep behind enemy lines. So negotiations are underway with the United States, with the Pentagon. Right now we are looking at how many missiles are actually available.
And these negotiations and consultations are ongoing right now. But Trump's final decision will largely depend on Russia's response, whether it is ready to negotiate. From Washington, Dmitry Onopchenko, Serhiy Koval, the American Bureau of Inter-TV Channel, the United News Marathon.